Welcome to this second lecture of a two-part mini-series focused on the history and culture of Japan from the so-called medieval period through to the mid-20th century. Last time we saw that by forcing the Tokugawa shogun to sign an unequal treaty in 1854, the USA provoked a political crisis in Japan. Widespread domestic resentment and opposition to the Tokugawa grew rapidly in response to this, particularly amongst the samurai. The Tokugawa tried to imprison the samurai, but in a brief civil war, opposition armies trained by foreign experts and armed with Western weapons forced the shogun to resign. In January 1868, the young Emperor Meiji took power, the start of a successful reign that, as we will see, lasted for more than 4 decades until 1912. After years of conflict and the bloody civil war with the samurai, hopes ran high in Japan that the resignation of the Tokugawa government and the accession of Emperor Meiji would usher in a new era of peace and expansion for Japan. The new emperor was only a boy when he came to the throne, but he was the first Japanese emperor to rule with any real power since the early Heian era 7 centuries earlier. He chose the regnal name Meiji, which means enlightened rule, and he took the reins of power on August the 3rd, 1868, ushering in an era of Japanese history known ever since as the Meiji Restoration. As we will see, the Meiji era led to the complete political, economic, and even social reorganization of Japan and was responsible for its dramatic transformation into a modern global military and industrial power. Nowhere in the long pantheon of global history has there ever been such a rapid and dramatic transformation of any society anywhere. The Meiji Restoration and its imperial and ultimately self-destructive aftermath is the subject for this lecture, and it will be explored, I think, in 3 separate sections. The Meiji Restoration first, then the period of imperialist Japan, and then concluding with Japan's role in the Second World War. Now, the first thing we can say about the Meiji Restoration is that it brought to an end a series of military governments that had dominated Japan since the Kamakura shogun first claimed power way back in 1185. The second thing we can say is that, determined to gain equality with foreign powers, a conservative coalition of daimyo, nobles and samurai were determined to study and essentially copy the industrial policies of the West. In order to achieve this, the Meiji government sent many students and officials abroad to study everything from technology to political constitutions. And they also hired many foreign experts to come to Japan and help facilitate economic development there. In the next stage of modernization, the Meiji government abolished the old feudal order by removing the daimyo from power and abolishing the samurai, who rebelled but were crushed in 1878, again events outlined in the movie The Last Samurai. The Meiji also revamped the tax system by converting the old grain tax that the peasants had been paying for centuries into a monetary tax, which had the immediate effect of forcing inefficient farmers off the land. A new constitution was eventually proclaimed in 1889, and this remained the Constitution of Japan until 1947. Written by the government and based closely on European models, the document established a constitutional monarchy with a legislature known as the Diet, consisting of both an upper and a lower house. This rapid reorganization of the political structure demonstrates just how determined the Meiji were to cast off the traditional trappings of Chinese-style dynastic government, and for that matter, the semi-feudal structure that had dominated Japan's long Middle Ages. While certain of the foundational elements of Japanese culture did remain intact, Shinto religion, for example, and imperial government, the Japanese were much more willing, I think, to abandon other of the core values of Eastern civilization than, as we've seen, the Qing dynasty in China or the Choson dynasty in Korea were prepared to do. During the Meiji, then, we can clearly see an ancient Eastern civilization deliberately turning away from their ancient foundational ideals and explicitly embracing those espoused by an alternative region of the world, by Western civilization, in the hope of competing with aggressive, industrialized Western powers on the world stage. The end result was that as China and Korea lost their sovereignty to the West, Meiji Japan was quickly able to take its place as one of the world's leading industrial powers in less than 2 generations. According to this new Western-style constitution proclaimed by the Meiji Emperor, the emperor, powerless for centuries, now commanded the armed forces. The emperor now named the prime minister. The emperor appointed the cabinet, and he also had the right to dissolve the Diet, the parliament. The Meiji then created a modern transport, communications, and even educational infrastructure very much along Western lines, and also removed all barriers to internal trade. For the first time in Japan's history, universal primary and secondary education was introduced, and universities were created to provide advanced technical education. Most economic enterprises were private, but the government controlled all of the military industries and did all it could to stimulate industrial development generally. In particular, the government recruited the help of outside experts, more than 3,000 of whom were brought to Japan as gaikokujin, or hired foreigners. This was in line with the last article of the Meiji Charter Oath of 1868. And let me quote this. It states, "Knowledge shall be sought throughout the world so as to strengthen the foundations of imperial rule." Further evidence, I think, of the desire by the Meiji to look beyond the ideas of Eastern civilization now and seek help, seek inspiration from the West. In the 1880s, the government sold most of the remaining industries under its control to private investors and corporations, many of whom had close ties to Meiji officials. This had the effect of concentrating economic power in the hands of a small group of powerful capitalist enterprises known as the zaibatsu, which literally translates as the wealthy clique. Zaibatsu were the equivalent, I guess, of modern-day cartels or trusts, and were usually organized around a single family or clan. The big 4 zaibatsu during this period were Mitsui, Mitsubishi, Sumitomo, and Yasuda. These 4 zaibatsu owned companies that were active in all the various fields of economic activity in Meiji Japan. In foreign trade, for example, insurance, mining, iron and steel manufacturing, textile production, food production. They all owned banks as well to mobilize capital and direct it to wherever it was needed in the corporation. During the first half of the 20th century, the zaibatsu grew massively large, massively wealthy, but they were dissolved by Allied powers after the Second World War. In the 1950s, new enterprise groups emerged, many created by companies that had formerly been part of the big 4 zaibatsu. Cooperation within and between these groups helped drive Japan's remarkable post-war recovery, as we will see in one of our final lectures. Through all these initiatives, both government and private, by the early 20th century, Japan had joined the ranks of the major industrial powers. As I noted at the top of the lecture, this is quite frankly one of the most extraordinary and dramatic political and economic transformations in the annals of world history. But this rapid economic development came at a brutal cost for the peasants, who produced perhaps 90% of all government revenues during this reform stage, and who thus suffered from an appalling tax burden. Peasant uprisings broke out in 1883 and the following year, 1884, but they were ruthlessly crushed, as was a growing labour union movement in 1901. The result was that hundreds of thousands of peasants lived in destitution and starvation in a state that seemed to have no concern for the welfare of its workers. But these radical and painful reforms worked. By 1902, Meiji Japan was strong enough to be signing an alliance of equal power with Britain. Not an unequal treaty then, but an equal treaty. How extraordinary. And as we have seen, Japan then displayed its newfound military prowess with rapid and crushing victories over China in 1895 and 10 years later over Russia in 1905. These victories were mostly due to Japan's ability to gain access to modern military technology, a technology that was now being produced by Western innovation rather than Eastern. As early as 1876, the Meiji began to purchase modern warships from Britain, and as we saw in a recent lecture, they promptly used their naval muscle to force Korea to accept an unequal treaty with Japan. You might remember that when an anti-foreign rebellion broke out in Korea in 1893, the Qing dynasty sent a Chinese army to Korea to restore order. The Meiji were unwilling to recognize Chinese control over a land so close to them, so they declared war on China in August 1894. The Japanese Navy destroyed the Chinese Navy in 5 hours, and the Japanese army forced the Qing forces out of Korea. In the peace treaty that followed, the Chinese acceded Korea to Japanese influence and also gave up control of Taiwan and other East Asian islands. This easy Japanese victory startled other foreign powers, especially Russia, which, as we have noted on several occasions now, also had ambitions for territorial and diplomatic expansion in various parts of East Asia. Eventually, war between Japan and Russia broke out in 1904, and the following year, the Japanese Navy destroyed the Russian Baltic Fleet, which had sailed halfway around the world to support the war effort. This war also ended very quickly, so quickly that it was now absolutely clear to the entire world that by 1905, Japan had transformed itself into one of the major military and industrial powers of the globe. But when the First World War broke out in 1914, Japan entered the war in August of that year on the side of the Allies. It quickly demanded that Germany hand over its leased territories in China to Japan without compensation, and that all German warships withdraw from Chinese waters. The Japanese then quietly and rapidly took control of numerous German possessions in East Asia and throughout the Pacific. With the Allies preoccupied by the fighting in Europe, the Japanese also took the opportunity to present a charter of 21 secret demands to the new Republican government in China. More about this in the next lecture. The Meiji wanted confirmation of the Japanese hold on Chinese lands. They also wanted to establish industrial monopolies in China. They wanted joint Japanese control of the Chinese police force. They wanted a restriction of arms purchasing to Japanese manufacturers only, and an agreement that all Chinese arms purchases had to be approved by the Japanese government first. The Chinese had little option other than to accede to some of these demands, and only British support for the Chinese government and subsequent pressure from Whitehall on Tokyo prevented total capitulation. But Japan was determined to maintain a strong economic presence in Manchuria. They quickly built the Manchurian Railway and stationed Japanese troops there to protect it. All this meant that by the end of the Great War in 1918, the Japanese were poised to become not just a leading economic and military force, but also now a major global imperial power. After the Great War, Japan joined the League of Nations as one of the big 5 global powers, something, of course, that was absolutely inconceivable, impossible for any of the other less economically developed states of East Asia, like Vietnam, Korea, even China. In 1928, the Japanese government also signed the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which renounced war as an instrument of national policy. Throughout the 1920s, Japan's economy surged, creating genuine prosperity for most of the Japanese population for the first time in that country's long history. But this moment of economic prosperity was short-lived because Japan, like much of the developed world, suffered very badly during the Great Depression. The Japanese economy was by now greatly dependent on United States markets to sell its manufactured goods. And as demand in the US fell sharply, unemployment in all export sectors in Japan skyrocketed. This had dangerous ramifications for Japanese politics, and public demands for sweeping political and social reform were heard throughout the late 1920s and 1930s. The conservative Zaibatsu and the Meiji politicians blocked most of these reforms, although they did allow the establishment of universal male suffrage for all men aged over 25 in the year 1925. But by the early 1930s, a frustrated public was blaming the government for continuing economic problems. Right-wing groups now called for an end to party rule, and xenophobic nationalists started demanding the preservation of unique Japanese cultural elements like Shinto religion, like the ideals of the samurai, and the eradication of all Western influences. A campaign of murders and assassinations targeting business leaders broke out, culminating in the murder of the Prime Minister, Inukai Tsuyoshi, in 1932. Those politicians who supported Japan's continuing role in the international industrial capitalist system faced increasing opposition from those who favoured a militaristic vision of Japan as the dominant imperial power of East Asia. This militarist faction set their sights on China, arguing that political instability there made that vast country an inviting target for Japanese imperial expansion. The nationalists focused particularly on Manchuria. Japan needed to protect its considerable interests in Manchuria from the Chinese, they argued, particularly the Japanese-built Manchurian Railway, which was still being maintained by the Japanese. On the night of September the 18th, 1931, Japan's military used a staged pretext, that is, blowing up a section of their own railway in Manchuria and then accusing the Chinese of doing it, to launch a military invasion of the region. By 1932, Japanese troops were in control of all of Manchuria. In response to the invasion, the leader of the Chinese Kuomintang, the nationalist party that we'll be discussing in our next lecture, Chiang Kai-shek, appealed to the League of Nations for assistance to help stop Japanese aggression. The League did eventually call for the removal of Japanese troops, but the Japanese responded by leaving the League instead, and it appeared that nothing could be done by the global community to halt Japanese imperialism. The Japanese military now embarked on a series of conquests in East Asia, determined to create their own empire. In so doing, of course, they helped spark the Second World War, and it is Japan's involvement in the war that is the final topic for this lecture. The world's second global conflict really commenced not with the Nazi invasion of Poland in September 1939, but some 8 years earlier with Japan's attacks on China in the early 1930s. It was the Japanese conquest of Manchuria between 1931 and 32, the first step in a revisionist process of aggressive imperial expansionism that more accurately marks the beginning of the Second World War. By the early 1930s, it was clear to the world that civilian politicians in Japan had lost control of the government and that militarists and imperialists were now in charge. Following Japan's withdrawal from the League, it had no impediment to a continuation of its ultranationalist and pro-military expansionist policy. Believing that more territorial expansion was now essential to its very survival, the Japanese government launched a full-scale invasion of China in 1937. After the Battle of Marco Polo Bridge, fought in Beijing in July of that year, Japanese troops quickly took control of Beijing and then moved south towards Shanghai and the nationalist capital of Nanjing. By December 1937, Nanjing and Shanghai had both fallen, and for the next 6 months, the Japanese forces won repeated victories throughout China. China thus became the first nation in the world to experience the horrors of World War II. And by that I mean brutal, total warfare against civilians, followed by repressive occupation. Chinese civilians suffered death and destruction on a massive scale. Tens of thousands of citizens in Shanghai alone died from Japanese bombing of the city. And once Japanese troops entered Nanjing, inflamed by ultranationalism and by war passion, they raped at least 7,000 women, they murdered hundreds of thousands of unarmed civilians, and they burned down 1/3 of all dwellings in the city. Numbers are very difficult to pin down here, but an estimated 260 to 300,000 Chinese lost their lives as Japanese soldiers used them for bayonet practice and machine gunned them into open pits. As we'll see in one of the final lectures in the course, the Chinese actively resisted the Japanese invaders throughout the war, and Japanese aggression actually reignited slumbering Chinese nationalism, which only grew stronger the longer the war went on. In September 1937, the formerly bitterly opposed Chinese nationalists and communists, more on this in the next lecture, agreed to work together, uniting into an army of approximately 1.7 million men and women. Although the Chinese never defeated the Japanese, by 1941 they had tied up half the Japanese army. Meanwhile, the Japanese government allied itself with other aggressive states, forming the so-called Axis alliance. In September 1940, they signed the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy. This was a 10-year military and economic agreement. Next, they cleared the way for further Japanese empire building in Asia and the Pacific by signing a pact with the Soviet Union in April 1941. So, apart from the Chinese army, Japan did not face any determined opposition to its ambitions until the United States of America entered the conflict in December 1941. Even before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the USA had been inching towards involvement in the war. As Japanese forces continued their conquest in East Asia, capturing Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, the US government responded by freezing Japanese assets in the United States. But the Japanese ignored US demands to withdraw from China and from Southeast Asia, and they became even more intractable after October 1941, when Tojo Hideaki became Prime Minister. The new Japanese government immediately drew up plans for war against Britain and the United States of America. The Japanese hoped to destroy American naval power in the Pacific in a single blow with their attack on Pearl Harbor. On the 7th of December 1941, Japanese pilots took off from 6 aircraft carriers to attack Pearl Harbor. More than 350 Japanese planes sank or disabled 18 US ships, and American naval power in the Pacific was devastated. But of course, you know this. This ended up being the biggest mistake the Japanese could have made, because it gave the United States government the pretext it had been waiting for to immediately declare war on Japan, Germany, and Italy. Despite this, the Japanese went from victory to victory. They quickly captured Borneo, Burma, and the Dutch Indies, and Australia, the land of my birth, of course, was now in serious danger of invasion. The frankly humiliating surrender of British-held Singapore dealt a major blow to British prestige and shattered any lingering myths of European invincibility. The slogan under which Japan pursued the war was Asia for Asians, implying that the Japanese would lead Asian people to independence from European colonialists. Now, this, of course, was a clever piece of Japanese propaganda, because most of East, Southeast, and South Asia really was sick and tired of being under the thumb of Western imperial states, in some cases now for centuries. But continuing Japanese brutality, particularly against conquered Asian peoples, made it obvious to most Asians that the real agenda was Asia for Japan. The turning point in the Pacific War came with the Battle of Midway, fought on the 4th of June 1942. 3 Japanese carriers were sunk in 5 minutes, a 4th later that same day. And now it was the Allies who took the offensive, hopping from island to island until the United States forces gradually retook the Philippines and eventually islands close to Japan, such as Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The fighting at Iwo Jima and Okinawa was particularly savage. On Okinawa, the Japanese introduced a new war tactic, the kamikaze. These were pilots who volunteered to fly suicide missions with just enough fuel to reach Allied ships before smashing their aircraft into the ships. Carrier battles like Midway had inflicted incredible damage on the Imperial Japanese Navy air services, And frankly, there were very few experienced pilots or undamaged aircraft left by this stage. So the decision was made to send obsolete aircraft and inexperienced pilots into the air, most of whom volunteered to join the kamikaze units on these suicide missions against the enemy fleets. It's no surprise, of course, you folks know this now, that the name kamikaze was chosen for these units. As I'm sure you remember, this was the name the Japanese had given to the divine winds that had twice blown up and prevented the Mongols from invading Japan back in the 13th century. In the 2-month battle for Okinawa, the Japanese flew 1,900 kamikaze missions, which sank dozens of ships and killed more than 5,000 US soldiers and sailors. The savagery of the combat convinced many in the United States government and military that Japan would never surrender. The fall of Okinawa, Iwo Jima, and the Saipan Islands brought the Japanese homelands within easy reach of US bombers. And on the 6th and 9th of August in 1945, the US government, in an attempt to bring the war to a rapid end, decided to use their revolutionary new weapon, the atomic bomb, against the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki at an immediate cost of 200,000 lives. Japan surrendered on August 15th, and the war was officially over by the 2nd of September. With its utter defeat following the dropping of these 2 atomic weapons, Japanese humiliation was complete. The question now was, how quickly would Japan recover from the war, and what sort of social, economic, and political policies would the new government pursue? Would it return to the traditional thinking that had guided Japanese history for thousands of years now? Or would it be able to continue to embrace Western political and economic structures and ideas without losing its commitment to these traditional values of Eastern civilization, and also without returning to a militaristic and imperialist mindset? Ultimately, the role of the United States of America in Japanese post-war recovery would prove to be decisive, as we'll see, ensuring not only a rapid recovery, but also the creation of a stable Western-style democracy based on a robust export economy. And this facilitated Japan's complete rehabilitation and reacceptance into the ranks of major nations, where it has remained as a partner of stability and of moderation ever since. In the remaining handful of lectures in this course, we need to try and bring a lot of threads together. Although we've taken our story of Korea and Japan up to 1945, we last left China back in 1912 at the moment of abdication of the last emperor ever to rule there, the boy Puyi. In our next lecture then, we must return to China to pick up the story from the end of the Qing dynasty and follow Chinese political and cultural history through to the end of the Second World War. And that will leave us 3 final lectures to bring this extensive investigation of the foundations and evolution of Eastern civilization through to a satisfying conclusion. This is a tough job, but we can do it.